What if I told you that some of the most powerful men in American history were caught, or nearly caught, orchestrating secret operations that changed the course of our nation?
I began by telling the president that there was a cancer growing on the presidency, and if the cancer was not removed, the president himself would be killed by it.
Today, we're diving deep into 4 explosive late 20th century presidential conspiracies that shook the very foundations of American democracy.
Iraqi strength in heavy weapons was now a disadvantage in battles that at their peak involved 500,000 soldiers.
These stories aren't just history.
Because people have got to know whether or not their president's a crook. Well, I'm not a crook.
They're warnings. Let's get into it. First up, Watergate, the scandal that redefined political corruption. In 1972, President Richard Nixon was riding high, leading in the polls for what seemed like an easy re-election victory.
President Nixon has 570,000 votes and George McGovern 283,000.
Then everything changed with a single phone call in the early morning hours of June 17th.
Police arrested 5 men in the Watergate with bugging equipment and copying cameras.
Nixon's first reaction? Genuine confusion. What the hell were they doing there? He reportedly asked his chief of staff. After all, he was already winning. What Nixon didn't know was that zealous supporters within his committee for the re-election of the president, ironically nicknamed CREEP, had launched this rogue operation without his knowledge. These weren't seasoned operatives following presidential orders. They were overeager loyalists who thought they were protecting their president by gathering opposition research. The real tragedy began with what happened next.
Occurs now with Mitchell's recommendation that the only way to solve this, and we're set up beautifully to do it, in that, and that's the only network that paid any attention to last night was NBC, who did a massive story on the Cuban thing and all. But the way to handle this now is for us to have Walters call Pat Gray and just say, stay the hell out of this. This is business here. We don't want you going any further. That's not an unusual development.
Instead of immediately distancing himself from the break-in, Nixon made a fateful decision that would haunt him forever. He tried to protect his people. When his closest advisors, men he'd trusted for years, told him the break-in could be contained, that it was just a third-rate burglary, Nixon believed them.
In recent months, members of my administration and officials of the Committee for the Re-election of the President, including some of my closest friends and most trusted aides, have been charged with involvement in what has come to be known as the Watergate affair.
But those same advisors were already orchestrating a cover-up without fully informing the president of their actions. They moved money, pressured investigators, and made decisions that would later be attributed to Nixon himself.
What criticism do you have with your own behavior or style or things that you've done?
As president?
As president or as a human being?
Well, we don't have much time to cover the human being. Let's start with the president. First, naturally, the Watergate matter should have been handled properly. I should have concentrated on it, and apart from the fact that it was wrong, it was stupid. And generally, I'm called many things, but not often am I called stupid.
What Nixon couldn't have known was that he was walking into a carefully orchestrated trap. The CIA had deep ties to several of the Watergate burglars. Men like James McCord, who had worked for the agency for decades.
Political pressure from the White House was conveyed to me in January 1973 by John Caulfield to remain silent, take executive clemency by going off to prison quietly.
Even more troubling was the role of the reporter supposedly uncovering the truth. Bob Woodward, the Washington Post journalist who became famous for exposing Watergate, had his own intelligence background. Before joining the Post, Woodward had served as a Navy communications officer with high-level security clearance, briefing senior officials at the Pentagon.
This was during a period after we had suffered really a series of attacks, very strident attacks by the White House, really denying our stories, calling us character assassins and practitioners of shoddy journalism, and we were very much on the defensive. And so he responded with a little towel to his ass.
I think that has to do more with our own credibility than taking any joy in the guilt of others or something like that.
His mysterious source, Deep Throat, later revealed to be FBI Associate Director Mark Felt, wasn't just a whistleblower. Felt was a career intelligence official who felt passed over for FBI Director after J. Edgar Hoover's death. The pattern becomes disturbing when you connect the dots. CIA-connected burglars, an intelligence-linked reporter, and a bitter FBI official, all working to bring down a president who had been increasingly at odds with the intelligence community.
However, when I read Wired, the book written by, Woodward, about Belushi, I read like 5 pages of Wired, and I went, oh my God, they framed Nixon. like all of a sudden I went, oh my God, if this is what he writes about my friend that I've known, for half my adult life, which is completely inaccurate, talking to like the people of the outer circle getting the story, what the hell could they have done to Nixon?
By 1974, Nixon found himself abandoned by the very people who had created the mess. Facing impeachment proceedings driven by political opponents and a hostile media, he made the agonizing decision to resign. Not because he was guilty of ordering the break-in, but because he could no longer effectively govern.
That because of the Watergate matter, I might not have the support of the Congress that I would consider necessary to back the very difficult decisions and carry out the duties of this office in the way the interests of the nation will require. I have never been a quitter.
Nixon's resignation didn't just end a presidency. It marked the moment when Washington's political culture shifted from protecting institutions to destroying them. The man who had opened China, ended the Vietnam War, and created the EPA became history's most famous political casualty. Just a year later, in 1975, another major scandal erupted: the exposure of the Central Intelligence Agency's family jewels. This was the nickname given to a massive collection of classified documents that revealed some of the darkest activities of the CIA from the 1950s through the early 1970s.
The CIA released the documents on its website in response to a 1992 Freedom of Information Act request. CIA Director Michael Hayden called the documents a glimpse of a very different time and a very different agency.
What did these documents reveal? Shocking abuses of power. The CIA had plotted assassinations of foreign leaders like Fidel Castro. They had conducted illegal surveillance on thousands of American citizens, and including journalists and activists.
Agents watched former Washington Post reporter Michael Gettler for 3 months in 1971.
They were watching who I was talking to. They took pictures of who I was having lunch with. They actually took pictures through the picture window of our home.
CIA employees have nicknamed the documents the family jewels.
They had even engaged in deeply unethical experiments on unwitting civilians through programs like MK-Ultra, which involved dosing people with LSD to study mind control. The scope of these revelations was staggering. It became clear that the CIA, an agency created to operate abroad, had violated its own charter by targeting American citizens at home.
My father was a 49-year-old Montreal businessman who was successful and dynamic, and whose life was destroyed by a series of treatments. He was someone who became anxious for a relatively short period of time, who went to get some help, and whose life was totally shattered by the experience.
His father was one of the more than 50 patients treated here at the Allen Memorial Institute under a secret program designed to develop brainwashing techniques.
Congress was forced to act. The Church Committee, led by Senator Frank Church, held public hearings that exposed these abuses to the American people. The fallout was historic: the creation of permanent oversight committees in Congress, new laws limiting the powers of intelligence agencies, and a more skeptical view of secret government programs. The message was clear: even in the name of national security, there must be accountability.
I thought that it was a matter of real concern that planted stories intended to serve a national purpose abroad came home and were circulated here and believed here.
Perhaps no scandal better embodied the extremes of political ambition than the Iran-Contra affair. In defiance of a congressional ban known as the Boland Amendment, members of the Reagan administration devised a secret plan to continue funding the Contras. Anti-communist rebels fighting the Sandinista government in Nicaragua. At the same time, Iran, officially an enemy of the United States, was desperate for weapons. Despite an arms embargo, U.S. officials orchestrated secret arms sales to Iran, hoping to secure the release of American hostages held by Hezbollah in Lebanon. The money from these sales? It was funneled, illegally, to the Contras. When the operation was exposed in late 1986, it caused an enormous political firestorm. Congressional hearings revealed a complicated web of deceit, shredded documents, and rogue operations run out of the White House basement. Oliver North, a young Marine Corps officer, became the public face of the scandal, testifying in uniform before Congress.
One of the trends that people ought to look at is the fact that there were more terrorist acts against Americans in this hemisphere in the last few years than there were in the Mideast. A dramatic change in trend. It is coming closer to home.
He admitted to helping orchestrate the operation, but framed it as a patriotic duty. President Reagan insisted he had no knowledge of the illegal funding, although his leadership style, described by some as detached, came under heavy scrutiny.
I believe that the president was poorly advised and poorly served. I think that he should have followed up more and monitored this operation more closely. I think he was not aware of a lot of the things that were going on and the way the operation was structured and who was involved in it. He very clearly didn't understand all that.
While a handful of officials were convicted, many convictions were later overturned, and several figures were pardoned by President George H.W. Bush. Iran-Contra demonstrated that even after Watergate, high-ranking officials were still willing to operate outside the law, believing their ends justified their means. It also reinforced a dangerous pattern: covert foreign policy, hidden from the public and even from Congress, justified by a self-righteous vision of American exceptionalism. From Watergate's break-in and cover-up to the CIA's illegal experiments and arms deals with enemies, these conspiracies weren't random incidents. They were symptoms of a deeper disease, the temptation of absolute power and the belief that winning, whether in politics, espionage, or war, was worth any cost. Which of these conspiracies shocked you the most, or were you already suspicious of what goes on behind closed doors at the highest levels of power? Let's talk about it in the comments. And if you want more deep dives into the hidden stories that shaped history, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. Stay curious. Stay skeptical.